Good morning. All right, good people, you ready to go? Ready? See ready faces? Okay, here we go. All right, good morning officially. Welcome to Monday. I hope everyone had a good weekend. Good weekend? Good, Mark? Pretty good, all right? Yeah? Anybody do anything fun? So fun that you can't even tell me about it? So fun that it's probably illegal?
I went to Montreal.
Okay, how was that?
It was nice.
It's all right?
Yeah, I like the views.
Yeah, views are beautiful. And it was nice and sunny, right? Yeah, no, beautiful. That's a great place to kind of hang out. Anything else?
Went out and bathing.
Yeah, you bathing in the sun? Yeah, I did too. I got a little bit of sun on the neck. That's okay though. Yeah, no, it was a nice weekend, and hopefully you guys will continue to be able to enjoy your weekends. Although maybe it was just winter, but last term it seemed like I would ask, what people had done for their weekend, and it was like sleep. So hopefully we won't get there, later in the term, but we'll see. Okay. I think Unadi is the only one who's online, so good morning to you, and let's do some history. Right. So, on Friday, we were talking about the British home front. We said that, yes, there's lots of stuff happening at the war. Lots of battles are being fought back and forth, different maneuvers and pincher movements and, cutting off the flank and all that stuff that they do in battle. But important things were happening on the home front as well, right? That British society was kind of in flux, right? It was in transition. It was changing in terms of the socioeconomic structure of society, but also in terms of gender roles, right? And we know that huge numbers of young men went off to fight the war, and women stepped into their shoes, figuratively, but maybe literally as well, to work factory jobs and produce the things that the war needed. And that had a lot of effects in terms of empowering women, women kind of taking steps toward greater equality in society. Yeah, so that helped. It helped them gain the right to vote, and it kind of, I guess, minimized the differences a little bit between the sort of richest, most upper class British people and the lowest class, right? The upper class couldn't, gain access to all of the luxuries that they were used to during the war, but people lower on the social ladder were able to gain access to some things that before they couldn't afford, right? And so it was kind of it minimized inequality in society. It kind of brought the bottom end up and it pushed the top end down a little bit. I know you have no data in front of you to sort of make this decision, but do you think the same thing has happened during COVID? Do you think that things have become more equal or less equal? Just say, I know it's a tough question because I haven't really given you anything to base it off of, but what's your kind of instinct on that? More equal? Why do you think so then?
Just how I feel that the world has become a bit more equal.
Uh-huh.
Just everything seems more balanced now.
Okay.
It's not as crazy as it was before.
Okay, so it's definitely, we've definitely had a, good morning, we've definitely had a, yeah, things seemed very chaotic for a while, and it seems now where things are settling, right? People are getting vaccinated. It's unless you live in India, of course, which is kind of a different story at the moment. But yeah, things are maybe settling down. What do others think? Do you think it's more equal? Yeah. Okay. Right. Sure. So even though this is a disease that can infect any human on the planet, if you get COVID, people who have more money are more able to take care of themselves, right? They can afford private health care and doctors, and they can get themselves treated, right? And maybe a perfect example of that was Donald Trump, right? Donald Trump got COVID, but he wound up in the nicest hospital in the United States with the best doctors and experimental treatments, and he was in and out of that hospital in 3 days looking great, right? Waving to the camera, right? But again, he had the kind of health care that most people do not have, right? That's an important point. What else do you think? More or less equal? I don't know. I think certain companies certainly have made a lot more money. I mean, Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, gets cited in the news quite frequently as having made a huge amount of money during the pandemic. Good morning. Huge amount of money during the pandemic, whereas a lot of people have lost their jobs, right? Or they've been forced to close their business because they haven't been able to keep it open. Okay. All right, so we talked about that. Right. And so on Friday, I gave you a little assignment to do, right? I asked you to read this article. I gave you some questions, and you answered them for me. So I'm going to try and get those marked this evening. I've got a couple other things to do this evening, but I'm going to try and squeeze those in. And then we can kind of talk about maybe not so much what the answers were, because some of them rely on your own thinking and your own kind of assessment of what's more important. But maybe we can kind of point out what a good answer is and why it's a good answer. Okay, so we'll try to do that. I'll try to do that tomorrow, or if not tomorrow, we'll try and do it Wednesday, okay? Just so we know what we're doing. But I'll leave it for now. So, I have a few textbook questions for you. Gee, just two? Okay, that doesn't seem like very much. Just a few pages for you to read that talks about kind of what's going on in, we've been talking about the home front. Let's go back to the war and see the kind of things that are going on, okay? So I'll give you a few minutes to read this. The pages are in Microsoft Teams, just like they were before. So if you're online or if you're in class, you can access those. Oh, there it is. Did you get it from the bookstore or from Deborah?
When I came in, they gave it to me. Deborah gave it to me.
Oh, today?
Yeah.
Okay. So on the break, people, if you would like a textbook, you can go see Deborah and she will give you one, okay? So I wasn't sure if they were over or not, but they are. So maybe just for now, you can read the one on Microsoft Teams. If you want one after, you can go get one. You are definitely not in Teams, Crazio, but you're going to be in there in about 30 seconds, okay? Okay. Okay. Okay, my friend, you are added.
Get more.
Okay, so let's talk about this a little bit. I know there's kind of a lot of detail in this section of the text, and this is one of the places where you have to be careful with history because it's easy to get kind of lost in all of the details of what's going on. And so before we get to the two questions, what I'd like to ask you is what are the kind of important larger scale things to pull out of this section of the text? Based on what we just read, what are kind of the most significant things that we should pay attention to? Or what is this section of the text trying to tell us? What's this section of the text trying to tell us? Yeah. Yeah. So we hear a little bit about we hear a little bit about how the war is affecting each individual country, and we hear a little bit about some of the major battles, right? And so Verdun is one of them, which we'll talk about in a second, and the Somme is another kind of very significant one in the war as well. Talk about those very shortly. What else kind of stands out to you in this section? Right, so we hear again a little bit of a review of the technology that's being used in the war, right? And the fact that all of this is kind of brand new and being invented, you know, as the war unfolds. That's important. What else? Some other important things, Miles? Right, so it talks about the kind of the power differential between these countries and their ability to win the war. And what does winning the war rely on? Like how will this war be determined? Who's going to win? No. Like, I mean, in general. The industrial powers and the ability to control what? Yes, but how? Sorry, but it's connected to that industrial production thing. So it's going to go to the country that is able to continue to produce, weapons and men, right? Because this has become, and the text mentions this has become a war of attrition. What does that mean? Attrition. If you want to Google it, that's fine. ATTRITION. Just really bad at spelling out loud. What?
The process of reducing something's strength or effectiveness.
The
Or
pro-
sustained attack or effectiveness.
Right. Say that one more time.
The process of reducing something's strength or effectiveness through sustained attack or effectiveness.
Right. So reducing something's strength through sustained pressure or attack, right? So it's kind of like wearing the other side down, right? It's not going to be one decisive battle. It's going to be two sides grinding away at each other until finally one side is finished, right, and cannot go on any longer. And so it's basically just these industrial countries throwing things at one another, right? Weapons, bombs, guns, human lives, and whoever runs out of those things first, that's who loses, right? And so as you can see, there's no dollar figures yet, but as you can see, the cost of the war is unbelievably high. Like, look at those numbers of casualties, right? You don't see that in modern conflicts, thank God. But yeah, like you don't see 600,000 people dying in the course of a single battle, right? That is insane. But again, that's what this war was about, is just throwing as many soldiers and weapons as you could at the other side, hoping that they would run out first, right? Which is absolutely brutal, right? Especially when you remember, what is this war about? What are we fighting for? Yeah, to some degree, yeah. But how did this whole thing start? Yeah, yeah, the Archduke, right? And this is, why we're in this mess, because of that event. But nobody cares about him, right? Nobody, everybody's forgotten about it, and they're all trying to fight the war for some unknown reason, right? Tragic. So that's good. We hear about technology. We hear a little bit about the human costs of the war. We hear about the idea that this is a war of attrition, and these sides are just going to keep trying to wear each other down until somebody just cannot go on anymore. Let's talk about those two battles, Verdun and the Somme. What happens at Verdun?
The German wants to, they don't want to capture the France land, but like they want to have a attrition to France. Like they want to compare like who will run out all the resources and the soldier first, and then make them like surrender.
Yeah. So they're trying to.
Win the war.
What's that?
To win the war.
They're trying to win the war, one small French town at a time, right? And so the French town of Verdun, it's held by the French. The Germans are going to try to take it over. Do they succeed? They do not, right? So after months of fighting, nothing has changed, right? Which again that's textbook for the Western Front. There's a lot of fighting, nothing really happens. How many people die in this battle? Is that the 600,000 that I remembered?
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. That's over 500,000 soldiers just for that one town alone, never mind the rest of the war, right? Insanity. What about the Somme? What happens there? I think the Somme is in Germany. It's a river valley.
British want to push back the line, like the territory, and then in only start at like 40 kilometers of the battle, and then eventually they have succeeded a lot with a huge amount of loss of their soldiers, like 50%, and then they eventually can manage to push like 10 km to the German side.
Yeah. So there's a bit of an advance, right? A 10-kilometer advance. But again, think of the cost, right? The cost of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, right? And yeah, like again, you don't see wars like this anymore, thank God. But like the human cost is just difficult to imagine, right? I mean, do you know how many people live in the Lower Mainland here? I think it's about, I should double check this, but just in case I'm wrong, I think it's about 2.4 million people live in the Lower Mainland. So that's Vancouver and Burnaby and Richmond and kind of all the areas around here. So that's like a quarter of them in one battle, all of them dying, right? Unbelievable. Like it's I don't know about you, but for me it's difficult to imagine those amount of casualties in the course of a single battle. Like well, they say 5,000 a day, right? That's a lot of people. Let's talk about number 8 here for a second. So we know Russia gets pulled into the war because they are supporting Serbia, right? But they're actually going to leave the war, and we'll come back to this because Russia has kind of a longer story to tell. But how do they get themselves out of the war, or how do they leave the war? Yeah.
Because like Russian people are sick of the war, and then they are not like they don't want to fight against Germany anymore because they have lost so many, and then maybe they don't have enough supply to attend the war.
It's true. The Russian economy, and we'll come back to this, but Russia, when World War One starts, is not really an industrial power. Most of the country are poor peasants who have nothing, and so Russia is always able to send more men because they're a huge country with a big population, but their technology and industrial capacity is limited. So they're kind of sending their soldiers out there to fight with, no boots and no guns, and it's kind of a tragic situation. Huge numbers of Russians die in the process, and because of the sort of general poverty of the country and the loss of life, there's pressure to get out of the war, and because of the Russian Revolution and Vladimir Lenin, who we will come to later, he promises the people three things. He says peace, land, bread, right? And the peace part of that is, I will get you out of the war, right? So we'll get to this later too, but Lenin overthrows the Russian government, and then he goes to the Germans and says, okay.
There was a treaty.
Yeah, and then there was a treaty. Do you know what the treaty was called?
Or something.
Yeah, yeah. Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, right? Where the Germans and the Russians come to an agreement. It's not a very good treaty for the Russians, but they desperately want out, and so they.
It was to build up the communism.
Yeah, they wanted to they wanted to focus on. Lenin needed to focus on kind of calming his enemy or sort of defeating his enemies, and then building communism. And so the war was kind of a big distraction from that, and so he was just trying to end it so they could get on with their communism, which they did. So they leave because they're poor, they're having famines, all of their young men are going off to fight this war and dying. The Russians aren't really interested in the war anyway, and so Lenin gets them out. Okay, let me just see where we are here so I can remind myself. Right, okay. Okay, let's take it's getting a little bit early, but let's take a little bit of an early break. We'll come back and we'll talk about the end of World War One, so that we can move on, because we've got an entire century to deal with and there's a lot to do. So take a break, come back, and we'll end World War One. Okay. All right. Back to this. So we did a little bit of reading. We talked about what was kind of happening in the context of the war. We saw lots and lots of casualties. We saw a few battles, the Somme and Verdun, where really huge numbers of soldiers die, huge numbers of resources are put into these battles, but really, to no effect, right? Either, at Verdun, a French-held village remains a French-held village. The Somme, they gain about 10 kilometers one way or the other, but the cost is immense, right? And we said that this is a war that costs, right? And so not only is it about industrial technology, but it's about who can outproduce whom, right? Who can throw the most resources at the war until the other side finally says, that's it. I'm out of bullets, I'm out of men, I'm out of bombs, I'm out of money. I can't go anymore, right? So that's kind of the war we're fighting. Not so much a strategic war, not so much a technological war, but it's just a war of resources, right? Who can throw more at this effort, right? Which, again, is going to make it a very costly war, both in number terms, but also in human cost, right? I don't know if anyone's doing the math so far, but we're talking hundreds of thousands of soldiers over the course of 4 years, right? So there's going to be a big price to pay at the end of this thing. We also mentioned, of course, that Russia is going to exit the war at this point, and they're going to exit the war basically for the reason that we just spoke about. They don't really have the resources to keep going. They're not really an industrial power. They're kind of a country full of poor peasants just trying to survive. And they just don't have the industrial capability to keep going, right? And so Vladimir Lenin gets them out of the war, they settle with the Germans, and then they go off and do their own thing, but we'll come to them later. Okay, good so far? Good so far? Okay. So I don't really like to do this to you twice in one class. It's not fair, but I do have a little bit more for you to read. As I say, I try to do a little bit of reading and then a little bit of something else so that we, change it up a bit. But as it turns out today, I have 2 sections that I would like you to read. As I mentioned, this will bring us kind of to the end of the war because we want to talk about how it ends, but we also want to talk about what comes after, because the aftermath of World War I is really what's going to kind of set the table, if you will, for the rest of the 20th century. So it's important to understand how the war ends and kind of what kind of arrangements are made at the end, because they will be important going forward, okay? So again, as I said, I'm sorry to do this to you twice in one day. I'll try not to, but we have a little bit more to read and a few more questions to answer, okay? So I'll turn you loose to do those, and then we'll talk about them in just a little bit, okay? Okay, so hopefully that's enough time. Let's look at what we've talked about here. So, as you can see, this section of the text talks about kind of the turn of the tide, right? We have the Russians leaving the war, but we have a new ally showing up, the Americans. And why on earth did the Americans get involved in this disaster?
Is that war with Mexico?
War with Mexico, yeah. How does that come about?
It started like German attacked a civilian ship,
Yeah.
and then like there's like 100 of U.S. People in there, and then U.S. got pissed off, and then they like this. The great point is like when British decoded the text from German, the German was asking Mexico to attack U.S.
Yes.
And that like British send the decoded telegram to US, and then US declare war to them.
Right. So it's kind of a crazy story, right? But the Germans sink. The Germans are trying to sink supply ships coming from the U.S. for the whole war, but they sink Lusitania, right? And she's a passenger ship, and so a bunch of Americans, drown in the sinking of Lusitania, and the Americans are upset, right? And so to try to distract them, Germany sends a message to Mexico and says, hey, Mexico, if you want to declare war against the U.S. and try to take, New Mexico and Arizona and Texas, if you want to try and take those states, we'll support you, right? But unfortunately for them, well, this is a ridiculous thing, but unfortunately for them, the British intercept it, right? And so when the Americans are told that Germany is trying to start some you-know-what in their backyard, they're not happy, right? And so they respond by declaring war on Germany, right? And so what does the U.S. kind of bring to the war in the early part of, in the early stages of their involvement? Yeah, they don't really have a standing army at the moment, right? They're not really ready to fight, but they can provide Britain with materials and assistance and money that they might need, right? And so they do, right? They're manufacturing weapons, tanks, and planes. They're sending them over to Europe. They're giving them the British money that they need and food and other things, but they won't be able to have their armies ready immediately. And as it turns out, relatively few Americans will wind up actually fighting in the war, because by the time the Americans get over there ready to fight, the whole thing's kind of over anyway, right? So few Americans get a chance to fight, but not a whole ton. Right. Let me just look at my questions here. Oh yeah, okay. So this is kind of, to me, this is kind of funny, but tragically funny. when the Americans are thinking about declaring war on Britain, they ask both sides for their war aims, right? So they say, what is this war about? What are you actually trying to accomplish? And so for Germany, what are their war aims? What are they trying to accomplish, Miles?
Germany wants to occupy Wilson territory of the same way as Brest to occupy the country.
Yeah, so the Germans definitely want to occupy parts of France, but they want to occupy other areas as well. What else do they want in terms of territory? Yeah, they want to achieve economic self-sufficiency, and they give that a name. What do they call it? Autarky, right? I'm not sure if this is an English word or a German word, or I've never I've never heard anyone use it in conversation. I don't think you should, gee, I can't wait till I move out of my parents' house and then I can achieve autarky. I don't think I've ever. You think it's a German word? It could very well be. So yeah, it's talking about economic self-sufficiency, right? Germany doesn't want to be dependent on anyone else, and so it's going to need some more land, right? So it's trying to borrow some from Belgium, it's trying to take some from Belgium and from France, and also from Poland and from the Ukraine, right, Andre and Sophie? Poland and the Ukraine. Poland and the Ukraine. They're going to try and take over that land so that they can turn it into farmland and feed their people, right? And of course, the people that are there right now, well, they're going to have to get out, right? What are the Germany and France? What are their war aims? Not Germany, Great Britain. What's their war aims? This is the tragically funny part for me, anyway. Yeah, they kind of come to that after, but like Ben says, at first they're like, oh well, we're trying to win. Yeah, we're just trying to. Yeah, like what are your war aims? Well, to defeat the other side, right? That's why are you fighting this war? To win it, right? Which is, true, but also ridiculously simplistic, right? Like you're spending billions of dollars and killing thousands of young men to win this war so that you can win this war, right? And so, again, they do a little more thinking and they come up with, oh, well, we want Germany to retreat and this to happen and that to happen. So they kind of justify it after the fact. But initially, like, they haven't really thought it out. They're just fighting to fight, right? What's that? They did. They after careful consideration, they figured out what they were doing, right? Ridiculous. Anyway, right, so we've got Germany who's got some war aims. They're trying to establish economic self-sufficiency. We've got the triple entente, which is not really triple anymore because Russia's gone and France is kind of out of it. It's really just Britain fighting now. But Britain is fighting to win the war, but also they want to push Germany back inside its traditional boundaries and redraw the map of Europe along ethnic lines, right? And Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States at the time, he goes quite a number of steps further, right? And so he's got 14 points, right? So he brings this to the US Congress and he says, look, I think we should declare war on Germany, and these are the reasons this is what I think we should try to achieve. And so Woodrow has a very long, ambitious list of things he would like to have done, right? And so he does get the go-ahead, they declare war, and they're in, right? How does this war kind of come to an end? What's the kind of process of this war coming to an end? So we know that it's basically Germany fighting against Britain with the help of the U.S., right? Austria-Hungary is kind of weak and kind of out of it. The Ottoman Empire is weak and kind of out of it. Russia has already timed out and they're doing their own thing. So it's just down to these kind of three parties. And so how does this thing eventually wind down?
Germany is running out of resources, and they decided to like have a final push to the border. So
Yeah, so that war of attrition thing is finally coming to an end, right? So it's a question of who will run out of resources, and the answer is it's going to be Germany, right? They're going to try to make a final push to get to Paris and take Paris. They don't make it. They don't have enough men. They don't have enough food. They don't have enough weapons, and so finally they decide to pack it in, right? We hear about a few kind of governmental uprisings, right? The Kaiser steps down and flees to Netherlands, which is nice, right? He's made quite a mess of things over the past few years, and now he's just going to bail and go to Netherlands. But anyway, he does that. There's a few governmental upheavals before we have a democratic government installed, right? The Weimar government, or the Weimar Republic. It's called that because it's centered in the city of Weimar, Germany. So they have a democratic government, and the democratic Weimar government says, okay, time out, let's talk, right? Let's stop fighting and let's talk. They talk in the text about a scorched earth thing, and you kind of hear people talk about this in a number of different contexts, but what does that mean in this context? Andre, can you help me out with this one? What's this scorched earth thing? Or anyone? What does it mean, this scorched earth?
In the agricultural sense, they couldn't stay on anymore.
Yeah, so the Germans had kind of pushed forward into France to a certain point, and then they were kind of forced to sort of go back to Germany. But as they go back, they destroy everything in their path, right? So it's like, oh, okay, you're going to take your land back, fine, but we're going to destroy it on the way. And so, they salt the fields, they kill all the livestock, they burn down all the buildings, knock down the telephone poles. Kind of a sore loser thing to do, right? But anyway, but that's what they do. And so they sort of destroy that section of France as they retreat back inside their borders, right? Yeah, so now we have a bit of a timeout. Everyone gets to take a breather, go home, relax a little bit before the major powers kind of get together again at Versailles, right, in early 1919 to kind of sort out the peace treaty. And lots of countries are there around the table, but notably, who's not there? Russia's not there, right? In their defense, they're a little distracted with, a civil war at the time, but they're not there. And who else is not there? Notably. This is an important one. They really, huh? No, we're there. Actually, we got our own seat at the table. We got to sit at the adult table, not at the kids' table. Yeah, it was a big moment for Canada. I'm joking, but I'm also not. It was a big moment for Canada. But who's not there? Yeah, but they're kind of not part of this. So that's not strange. Germany's not there. Yeah. Which is a little shocking, right? Because they're a major player in this conflict. And yet, well, yes. But also no. But we'll get to that. So everybody gets together at Versailles to kind of work this thing out, right? And as I say, everyone's there. Anyone is there, except for Russia, who's in the middle of a civil war, and Germany. And again, that's an important point, right? So here's what these guys come up with at the, I guess it's partway through 1919. I think it's August or something. Yeah, they start in January. Is there a date on this? Oh, June, sorry, June 28th. So it takes them about 6 months or so to hammer this thing out. So this is actually it. This is the cover page of the Treaty of Versailles, right? The Allied and Associated Powers, or a treaty of peace between the Allied and Associated Powers and Germany, right? So, yeah, they start in 1919. Again, there's a lot of countries around the table, but really the only, the voices that are really having the say are these four, right? So there's Woodrow Wilson from the United States, there's George Clemenceau from France, there's Vittorio Orlando from Italy, and there's, who am I missing? Oh yeah, David Lloyd George from Great Britain, right? So, here we go, oops. Yeah, so here they are. Here's these four guys. Vittorio Orlando, who's the second from the left, he's gonna go home early because people aren't really listening to him. He thought Italy was gonna get some territory back in the treaty, and they really weren't getting it. They didn't get it. So he kind of stormed off and said, well, I'm out of here then. So it basically it's left to Woodrow Wilson, who's on the far right. He's the American. George Clemenceau is the guy with the epic mustache there. And then David Lloyd George here on the far left. Okay? Now, these guys have different, maybe this is the last thing I'll say. Whoops. These guys have kind of different ideas about how this treaty should go, okay? And I'll talk about it a little bit more tomorrow. But the question is, what do you do with Germany, right? How do we treat them? Should we punish them for what they've done here? Or should we kind of say, you know what? This is everyone's fault or no one's fault. Let's just try to rebuild Europe here. This isn't about punishment, right? So there's kind of two poles here, right? Punish Germany, man, they did an awful thing here. Or let's not punish anyone, let's just try to rebuild Europe, okay? So George Clemenceau here from France, he's on the punish Germany side, right? He thinks that Germany did a horrible thing. They've cost the continent millions of lives and billions of dollars. This is all their fault. Let's punish them, right? On the other side, we've got Woodrow Wilson, right? And Woodrow is from the United States. Woodrow is feeling, let's not punish anybody. Let's just try to rebuild a better continent. Let's make sure we don't have a war again, right? And in some ways, it's easy to see why these guys feel that way, right? Because France, like half of France has just been destroyed by the German army, right? And France has been fighting with the Germans for 4 years. So you could see how George Clemenceau would be a little bit unhappy with the Germans, right? Whereas it's really easy for Woodrow Wilson to walk in and say, hey guys, let's all chill, let's not punish anyone, because he hasn't been fighting, right? And the US isn't destroyed in World War I, right? So it's very easy. What's that?
He didn't lose as much.
No, they didn't lose as much. And so it's easy for Woodrow to say, hey guys, let's hug it out, right? Let's just be friends. And it's very understandable that George Clemenceau would be like, no, Germany's going to go down for this, right? They're going to pay, right? They're going to pay big time. For his part, David Lloyd George is kind of in the middle, okay? So David Lloyd George from Britain, he's kind of leaning towards Woodrow Wilson, okay? He feels that, we should probably just rebuild Europe. We shouldn't punish them. But on the other hand, the public at home, so the citizens of Britain, they want to punish Germany. So he's kind of in the middle, right? Because he's got a public who's telling him, punish Germany, and he's personally feeling like, I don't know if that's such a good idea. So he's kind of somewhere in the middle, right? The last thing I'll say here is what's going to come out of this is some sort of an average, right? So George Clemenceau here in France is going to be unhappy that Germany wasn't punished more, okay? David Lloyd George and Woodrow Wilson are going to come out of this thinking, ooh, maybe we punished Germany too much, okay? So it's going to be a bit of a compromise between everybody, right? And it's going to be, pardon me, as we'll see, it's a very imperfect settlement, right? It doesn't really please anyone around the table. It doesn't really do what it's supposed to do, unfortunately. And Germany, of course, is going to have a major problem with it because they don't get to negotiate it. And as it turns out, once it's done, once it's done, this thing just gets dropped on the prime minister's desk, and they basically tell him, sign here or we're bringing our armies in, right? And so Germany doesn't get a chance to negotiate or to offer their thoughts or, give it a read. It's like, here it is, sign it or else, right? And the government does, right? They do sign it because they don't really have another choice. But as we'll see, that's not going to go over well in Germany.
Not at all.
Not at all. No, it's going to be a very it's just not going to fly, right? But that we will discuss tomorrow. So, pack it up, my friends. Have a nice afternoon. See, I don't think the rain's coming back, so that's kind of nice. Pack it up. I'll see you tomorrow. That is all.